Vienna, winter of 1806. In a dimly lit room, a Habsburg prince lies feverish, his breath shallow. On his cheek, a small shaving cut, now swollen and red. No battlefield, no assassination plot, just one careless stroke of a razor. On Christmas Eve, Ferdinand Karl of Austria-Este took his final breath, claimed by infection. In this video, we reopen the pages of history to trace that seemingly harmless wound and ask, was it an accident, fate, or something far more deliberate? Vienna, winter of 1806. In a dimly lit room, a Habsburg prince lies feverish, his breath shallow. On his cheek, a small shaving cut, now swollen and red. No battlefield, no assassination plot, just one careless stroke of a razor. On Christmas Eve, Ferdinand Karl of Austria-Este took his final breath, claimed by infection. In this video, we reopen the pages of history to trace that seemingly harmless wound and ask, was it an accident, fate, or something far more deliberate? By the time Ferdinand Karl reached his late teens, the course of his life was already charted with the precision of a military campaign. In 1771, at the age of 17, he was married to Maria Beatrice d'Este, the heiress to the duchies of Massa and Carrara, and a woman whose lineage was as carefully measured as her dowry. The union was less a love story than a treaty in human form, binding the Habsburgs to the venerable House of Este, whose influence stretched across northern Italy. Maria Beatrice was, by the standards of the day, a valuable match. Well-bred, intelligent, and the only surviving child of Ercole III d'Este, Duke of Modena and Reggio. Through her, Ferdinand Karl gained the promise of titles, lands, and a foothold in the intricate web of Italian politics. But the match was as much about consolidating power as it was about personal compatibility. In the 18th century Habsburg court, affection was secondary. Alliances were paramount. Soon after their wedding, Ferdinand Karl was appointed governor of the Duchy of Milan, a post that seemed, at first glance, a glittering prize. Milan was one of the crown jewels of the Habsburg possessions in Italy, wealthy, strategically positioned, and steeped in the grandeur of Renaissance culture. As governor, Ferdinand Karl's name appeared in proclamations, his signature on decrees, his presence required at ceremonies both sacred and civic. The governor's palace in Milan reflected the dignity of his position. High-ceilinged salons adorned with frescoes, crystal chandeliers casting warm light over polished marble floors. Courtyards where the sound of fountains mingled with the hooves of ceremonial carriages. There were banquets with silver trays piled high with delicacies from across the empire. Operas performed in his honor. Diplomatic receptions where the air was thick with perfume, candle smoke, and the murmur of political intrigue. And yet, beneath the surface splendor, the reality was more hollow. The real power in Milan did not reside in the governor's palace. It resided hundreds of miles away in Vienna. Every significant decision, taxes, troop movements, major legal reforms, was subject to the approval of the Austrian court. Ferdinand Karl was, in many ways, a caretaker rather than a ruler, a figurehead who embodied imperial authority but exercised little of it. To the public, he was the face of Habsburg governance in Lombardy. His presence at civic events reassured the citizens that Vienna's hand was steady. But behind closed doors, his role was tightly constrained. His correspondence with the imperial chancellery was filled with requests for permission, reports awaiting endorsement, and instructions he was obliged to follow without question. Still, he performed his duties with the decorum expected of a Habsburg prince. He presided over religious festivals, welcomed foreign dignitaries, and patronized the arts. The city's nobility and merchant elite attended his salons, where conversations shifted seamlessly from court gossip to discussions of trade and politics. His marriage to Maria Beatrice produced children, securing the dynastic line and further intertwining the fortunes of the Habsburg and Este houses. But in quieter moments, Ferdinand Karl must have been aware of the limits of his autonomy. His position in Milan was, in many respects, a gilded cage. The titles were real, but the authority they implied was illusory. Every ribbon cutting, every military parade, every formal audience was a performance staged for the benefit of an empire whose priorities were determined elsewhere. Maria Beatrice, by contrast, held a more tangible claim to independent rule, at least in theory. As Duchess of Massa and Carrara in her own right, she was accustomed to being treated as a sovereign in her own territories. Yet even she found her decisions subject to the constraints of Austrian oversight. The marriage, though politically advantageous, did not elevate either of them to true independence. Instead, it bound them more tightly to Vienna's strategic agenda. Life in Milan during this period was a blend of ceremonial duty and social opulence. The couple attended grand balls at the Teatro alla Scala, dined under frescoed ceilings in the homes of the city's elite, and toured the countryside in ornate carriages to inspect local projects. There were moments of genuine cultural enrichment, supporting artists, commissioning works of architecture, encouraging the sciences. But always, the shadow of Vienna loomed, reminding them that their reign was provisional, their power delegated. The people of Milan, for their part, treated Ferdinand Karl with the respectful distance owed to a foreign-appointed ruler. They cheered at parades, bowed in the streets, and applauded at public appearances. But there was no mistaking that he was a representative of imperial authority, not a native sovereign. He was both honored and held apart, admired for his position, but not entirely embraced as one of their own. For Ferdinand Karl, the governorship was a test of endurance as much as it was a role of prestige. He had to balance the expectations of Vienna with the needs of Milan, to maintain the appearance of authority while knowing that the true levers of power were out of reach. It was a delicate dance, one that required patience, restraint, and a willingness to accept that his place in history might never match the grandeur of his title. In these years, the young prince was still insulated from the storms that would later batter his life. Napoleon's armies were still a distant rumor. The collapse of his political position had not yet begun. But already, there were hints of the fragility beneath the facade. A governorship dependent on the goodwill of a distant court. A marriage bound more by treaty than by passion. A city that, for all its glitter, knew its ruler was only a custodian of another empire's will. For now, Ferdinand Karl played his part well. The operas still sang in his honor. The palace still glowed with candlelight on winter nights. But the stage on which he stood was not his own, and the script had been written long before he arrived. In the years to come, the performance would end abruptly, the lights would go out, and the prince who had once stood at the heart of Milan's ceremonial life would find himself exiled from its stage entirely. The curtain, though, had not yet fallen, and in the soft glow of the governor's palace, with Maria Beatrice at his side and the applause of Milan still ringing faintly in his ears, Ferdinand Karl could not yet imagine just how quickly the world he knew would vanish. By the time Ferdinand Karl reached his late teens, the course of his life was already charted with the precision of a military campaign. In 1771, at the age of 17, he was married to Maria Beatrice d'Este, the heiress to the duchies of Massa and Carrara, and a woman whose lineage was as carefully measured as her dowry. The union was less a love story than a treaty in human form, binding the Habsburgs to the venerable House of Este, whose influence stretched across northern Italy. Maria Beatrice was, by the standards of the day, a valuable match. Well-bred, intelligent, and the only surviving child of Ercole III d'Este, Duke of Modena and Reggio. Through her, Ferdinand Karl gained the promise of titles, lands, and a foothold in the intricate web of Italian politics. But the match was as much about consolidating power as it was about personal compatibility. In the 18th century Habsburg court, affection was secondary. Alliances were paramount. Soon after their wedding, Ferdinand Karl was appointed governor of the Duchy of Milan, a post that seemed, at first glance, a glittering prize. Milan was one of the crown jewels of the Habsburg possessions in Italy, wealthy, strategically positioned, and steeped in the grandeur of Renaissance culture. As governor, Ferdinand Karl's name appeared in proclamations, his signature on decrees, his presence required at ceremonies both sacred and civic. The governor's palace in Milan reflected the dignity of his position. High-ceilinged salons adorned with frescoes, crystal chandeliers casting warm light over polished marble floors. Courtyards where the sound of fountains mingled with the hooves of ceremonial carriages. There were banquets with silver trays piled high with delicacies from across the empire. Operas performed in his honor. Diplomatic receptions where the air was thick with perfume, candle smoke, and the murmur of political intrigue. And yet, beneath the surface splendor, the reality was more hollow. The real power in Milan did not reside in the governor's palace. It resided hundreds of miles away in Vienna. Every significant decision, taxes, troop movements, major legal reforms, was subject to the approval of the Austrian court. Ferdinand Karl was, in many ways, a caretaker rather than a ruler, a figurehead who embodied imperial authority but exercised little of it. To the public, he was the face of Habsburg governance in Lombardy. His presence at civic events reassured the citizens that Vienna's hand was steady. But behind closed doors, his role was tightly constrained. His correspondence with the imperial chancellery was filled with requests for permission, reports awaiting endorsement, and instructions he was obliged to follow without question. Still, he performed his duties with the decorum expected of a Habsburg prince. He presided over religious festivals, welcomed foreign dignitaries, and patronized the arts. The city's nobility and merchant elite attended his salons, where conversations shifted seamlessly from court gossip to discussions of trade and politics. His marriage to Maria Beatrice produced children, securing the dynastic line and further intertwining the fortunes of the Habsburg and Este houses. But in quieter moments, Ferdinand Karl must have been aware of the limits of his autonomy. His position in Milan was, in many respects, a gilded cage. The titles were real, but the authority they implied was illusory. Every ribbon cutting, every military parade, every formal audience was a performance staged for the benefit of an empire whose priorities were determined elsewhere. Maria Beatrice, by contrast, held a more tangible claim to independent rule, at least in theory. As Duchess of Massa and Carrara in her own right, she was accustomed to being treated as a sovereign in her own territories. Yet even she found her decisions subject to the constraints of Austrian oversight. The marriage, though politically advantageous, did not elevate either of them to true independence. Instead, it bound them more tightly to Vienna's strategic agenda. Life in Milan during this period was a blend of ceremonial duty and social opulence. The couple attended grand balls at the Teatro alla Scala, dined under frescoed ceilings in the homes of the city's elite, and toured the countryside in ornate carriages to inspect local projects. There were moments of genuine cultural enrichment, supporting artists, commissioning works of architecture, encouraging the sciences. But always, the shadow of Vienna loomed, reminding them that their reign was provisional, their power delegated. The people of Milan, for their part, treated Ferdinand Karl with the respectful distance owed to a foreign-appointed ruler. They cheered at parades, bowed in the streets, and applauded at public appearances. But there was no mistaking that he was a representative of imperial authority, not a native sovereign. He was both honored and held apart, admired for his position, but not entirely embraced as one of their own. For Ferdinand Karl, the governorship was a test of endurance as much as it was a role of prestige. He had to balance the expectations of Vienna with the needs of Milan, to maintain the appearance of authority while knowing that the true levers of power were out of reach. It was a delicate dance, one that required patience, restraint, and a willingness to accept that his place in history might never match the grandeur of his title. In these years, the young prince was still insulated from the storms that would later batter his life. Napoleon's armies were still a distant rumor. The collapse of his political position had not yet begun. But already, there were hints of the fragility beneath the facade. A governorship dependent on the goodwill of a distant court. A marriage bound more by treaty than by passion. A city that, for all its glitter, knew its ruler was only a custodian of another empire's will. For now, Ferdinand Karl played his part well. The operas still sang in his honor. The palace still glowed with candlelight on winter nights. But the stage on which he stood was not his own, and the script had been written long before he arrived. In the years to come, the performance would end abruptly, the lights would go out, and the prince who had once stood at the heart of Milan's ceremonial life would find himself exiled from its stage entirely. The curtain, though, had not yet fallen, and in the soft glow of the governor's palace, with Maria Beatrice at his side and the applause of Milan still ringing faintly in his ears, Ferdinand Karl could not yet imagine just how quickly the world he knew would vanish. When Ferdinand Karl returned to Vienna in 1796, the city received him with the formality owed to an imperial prince. The carriage wheels clattered over cobblestones as he entered the capital through gates he had known since youth. Courtiers bowed, chamberlains opened doors, and the official welcome was warm. Polished words, ceremonial dinners, a place at the imperial table. But behind the etiquette, there was a current of something colder. Vienna was a court that never forgot. Everyone knew he had arrived not as a victorious governor recalled in honor, but as a displaced one, stripped of his post by Napoleon's swift advance. The reality was that Ferdinand Karl returned home, diminished. The imperial court in the late 18th century was an intricate machine, its gears powered by influence, gossip, and proximity to the throne. Without an active governorship or a key administrative post, Ferdinand Karl found himself outside the court's main orbit. He still wore the titles Archduke of Austria, Governor General, retired, of Lombardy. But they were ceremonial now, anchors to a past role rather than tickets to present power. His days became a procession of appearances that meant everything in form and little in substance. He attended Mass with the family at the Habsburg chapel, stood in formal lines at diplomatic receptions, and took his seat at banquets where the real decisions were whispered in side chambers to which he was no longer invited. He was still treated with deference, but it was the deference one gave to a relic, valuable in tradition, irrelevant in practice. The Habsburg Palace, with its sprawling wings, grand staircases, and echoing galleries, was both his home and his cage. His apartments were comfortable. Tapestries on the walls, polished parquet floors, servants in livery. But they were also enclosed, hemmed in by the same stone walls that had seen centuries of power plays. Ferdinand Karl could walk its halls for hours and still feel as though he was moving in circles, never truly going anywhere. Maria Beatrice adapted to Vienna's rhythms with a pragmatism that Ferdinand Karl seemed to lack. She focused on her children, on maintaining their position in the complex marriage market of Europe's nobility. Two of their daughters would eventually marry into prominent houses, and their son Francis would inherit the Este titles from her side of the family. But even in these successes, Ferdinand Karl played a peripheral role. His influence was limited to nods of approval in arrangements negotiated largely by others. At times, he retreated into the smaller routines of aristocratic life. Hunting expeditions in the countryside, musical evenings in private salons, occasional visits to the theater. But even these pleasures carried a muted tone. He was no longer the host of Milan's grand receptions, no longer the man in whose honor overtures were composed and toasts were raised. In Vienna, he was one of many archdukes, comfortably placed, politely regarded, and politically unnecessary. It is possible that the loss of Milan weighed on him more heavily than he allowed anyone to see. In public, he remained gracious, his manners impeccable. In private, he may have replayed those final days in Lombardy, the hurried departure, the French banners in the streets. For a man raised in the Habsburg tradition, where the dynasty's image was paramount, such a loss was not just personal. It was an injury to the family honor, and by extension, to his own identity. Napoleon's shadow loomed even in Vienna. News of battles, treaties, and shifting alliances filled the court's conversation. Every victory the French scored on the continent was a reminder of what had been lost, and of how quickly the old order was being rewritten. Ferdinand Karl watched it unfold from the sidelines, part of a generation of princes trained for a kind of governance that the new Europe was beginning to discard. The isolation was not only political, but emotional. Many of his siblings were busy with their own realms and responsibilities. Joseph II was gone. Leopold II had passed after only 2 years on the throne, and Francis II, the last Holy Roman Emperor, was consumed with the ongoing wars. Ferdinand Karl, without an official role, had little to contribute to the empire's pressing concerns. He was present, but he was peripheral. Even within the family, there was an unspoken hierarchy. In a dynasty that measured worth by the scope of one's duties, those without active posts inevitably slid toward the margins. Ferdinand Karl had a seat at the table, but not a voice in the council. His opinions, if offered, carried the weight of courtesy rather than necessity. There were, of course, moments of warmth. Family gatherings, christenings, and feast days brought the extended Habsburg clan together. There was laughter, music, and the shared nostalgia of siblings who had grown up under Maria Theresa's formidable eye. But Ferdinand Karl's role in these occasions was that of a participant, not a central figure. He was part of the tableau, not the story. Vienna itself was changing during his years of exile. The city's salons buzzed with Enlightenment ideas. Its theaters staged new works that blended tradition with modern sensibilities. Yet, for all this intellectual energy, the court remained bound by ritual. Ferdinand Karl moved through it like a man performing a part written decades earlier, the script unchanged, even as the stage around him shifted. His wealth and status ensured comfort. But comfort is not the same as purpose. Without the daily responsibilities of governance, without the urgency of representing imperial authority in a volatile territory, Ferdinand Karl's life in Vienna lacked the rhythm and direction that Milan had provided. Days blurred into weeks, weeks into years, each marked more by ceremonies attended than by achievements earned. And so the prince lived in a kind of gilded limbo, neither disgraced nor celebrated, neither in exile abroad nor fully at home in the machinery of Vienna's power. The city that had once been the heart of the empire now served as the backdrop to his quiet marginalization. It would be easy to think of these years as peaceful, but that would miss the undertow. For a man who had once been the symbolic ruler of a great Italian city, Vienna's polite sidelining was a daily reminder of his diminished role. He had not been defeated in battle, yet he had lost his place. He had not been stripped of his titles, yet he had been stripped of their meaning. What remained was the slow passage of time and the occasional flicker of relevance when family duty or ceremony called. It was a long, quiet exile in the very capital of his birth, a strange sort of banishment in which the walls of the palace were both shelter and prison. And as the years rolled on, Ferdinand Karl could not have known that his final chapter would not be written in the political histories of Vienna or the diplomatic archives of Europe, but in the most unlikely and humbling of ways. A single, small wound that would undo him entirely. By the winter of 1806, Ferdinand Karl was 52 years old. He had lived more than a decade in Vienna's polite obscurity, attending court functions, raising his children, moving through the routines of a life stripped of urgency. Age had softened his features, but also deepened the lines of someone who had long since learned to hide disappointment behind courtly composure. That December, the city was deep in winter. Snow lay thick on the roofs of the Habsburg, and the wind cut through the narrow streets with a bitterness that drove most people indoors. Within the palace, the air was warmer but heavy. The mingled scents of wood smoke, candle wax, and the faint tang of coal fires. It was in these quiet days before Christmas that the accident happened. By all accounts, it was an ordinary morning. Ferdinand Karl, preparing for another day of courtly appearances, began his toilette with the same ritual he had followed for years. Shaving was not a casual affair in the early 19th century. There were no safety razors, no antiseptic lotions. It was a slow process, with a sharp blade honed on a leather strop, hot water brought in by a valet, and a steady hand required to avoid injury. Perhaps it was haste. Perhaps it was a distraction, an unexpected thought, a momentary slip of focus. Or perhaps it was simply the inevitable miscalculation of age, when the skin loses its firmness and the blade no longer meets it with the same precision. Whatever the reason, the razor slipped. A small line of red bloomed just beneath his right cheekbone. Such nicks were common, unremarkable. A dab of cloth, a press of the fingers, and most men would have gone about their day. Ferdinand Karl's valet, accustomed to small shaving cuts, is said to have applied a simple dressing, likely linen or soft cotton. But within hours, the prince complained of irritation. By the following day, the area around the cut had begun to swell. In our modern world, it seems almost unbelievable that such a minor injury could be lethal. But in 1806, before the discovery of bacteria, before antibiotics, infection was an invisible predator. The smallest wound could become an open door to fever and death. Physicians knew nothing of sterilization. Razors, towels, even the water used could carry unseen dangers. As the days passed, the swelling worsened. The skin around the wound grew hot, flushed, and tender to the touch. Redness spread along his jawline and toward his ear. Soon the prince was shivering under heavy blankets, complaining of an aching head and a burning throat. The court physicians diagnosed it in the terms of the day: inflammatory fever, perhaps putrid fever. Today, we would call it what it was: sepsis. the body's fatal overreaction to infection. Treatment in the early 19th century was as crude as it was desperate. They bled him to release the heat and applied poultices of herbs meant to draw out the swelling. Leeches may have been used along the inflamed skin. He was urged to take broths and cordials, though his appetite was gone. The air in his chamber was thick and stale. Ventilation was thought to invite dangerous chills, so the windows remained closed. Fever set in quickly, rising in waves that left him alternately drenched in sweat and shaking with cold. His pulse grew erratic. Friends and family, summoned quietly, were shocked at the speed of his decline. The once sturdy man who had endured the upheaval of losing Milan was now brought low by a cut so small it could be hidden under a fingertip. By the third week of December, his condition had become grave. The infection had spread, swelling into his neck, perhaps down into the bloodstream. The physicians began to speak in guarded tones, their expressions more revealing than their words. In the imperial court, such moments were handled with discretion. The news was not announced, but within the palace walls, it was understood. Ferdinand Karl was unlikely to recover. The timing could not have been crueler. The city was preparing for Christmas. Church bells rang with Advent hymns. Market stalls offered roasted chestnuts and sugared almonds. Families gathered around hearths. Inside the Habsburg, his household kept vigil, the festive season muted into a hush. On the night of December 24th, the fever reached its final crescendo. Those present later described him as restless, murmuring incoherently, his skin flushed and dry. At moments he seemed to recognize the faces at his bedside. At others, he stared past them, eyes glassy, as if searching for something far away. Maria Beatrice was there, silent, her hand on his. She had stood beside him in Milan's glory and in their forced retreat, and now she stood beside him at the end. The physicians could do little more than offer sips of water, wipe his brow, and wait. Shortly before midnight, his breathing grew shallow, his chest rising and falling in uneven intervals. There was no dramatic last word, no grand farewell. Just a final, quiet exhalation as snow fell softly outside the palace windows. Ferdinand Karl of Austria-Este, once governor of one of Italy's greatest cities, died in his bed from the consequences of a shaving cut. He was 52 years old. In a dynasty accustomed to deaths on the battlefield, to poisonings whispered about in foreign courts, to illnesses that swept through children's nurseries, this was an ending both banal and tragic. There was no villain to blame, no conspiracy to unravel, only the stark reminder that, in his age, no one, not even an imperial prince, was safe from the smallest wound. The court announced his passing briefly, citing a sudden and severe illness. The true cause was discussed quietly, almost sheepishly, in salons and servants' quarters. To die from a shaving accident was not the kind of story that bolstered dynastic legend. And so the details were blurred, the facts softened, until the man himself began to fade from the empire's memory. Yet those who knew him could not forget the irony. Ferdinand Karl had survived political upheaval, exile, and the shifting fortunes of Europe's most turbulent era, only to be undone by the gentlest of blades, in the privacy of his own dressing room. It was, in every sense, the humblest of royal tragedies. And it left behind a lingering question, one whispered with a mix of disbelief and pity. How could so great a life end in so small a wound? The official account of Ferdinand Karl's death was short, clean, and deliberately unremarkable. His Imperial Highness has passed after a brief but severe illness. There were no court bulletins about the cause, No proclamations praising his service in Milan, no mention of the strange, humiliating way his life had ended. Within the formal language of Vienna's court, silence was often as telling as any confession. But outside the palace gates, silence created a vacuum. And vacuums are quickly filled with speculation. At first, the whispers were domestic, confined to the Habsburg's servants' corridors and the warm kitchens of Vienna's nobility. A valet who had once attended Ferdinand Karl let slip that the fatal wound came from a razor. Someone else repeated that the cut had been deeper than most knew. A chambermaid swore she'd heard that the prince's face had been visibly swollen days before his death. His skin flushed and fevered. These fragments began to travel, down staircases, across courtyards, and into the city's cafes, each retelling adding another layer of intrigue. For some, it was simply bad luck. The times were rife with tales of minor wounds turning lethal, farmhands dying from a nail scratch, seamstresses from a pinprick that festered. Vienna's physicians, even the most skilled, were powerless against infections they couldn't see and didn't understand. To this crowd, Ferdinand Karl's death was another sad reminder that no one, not even the mighty, could defy the hazards of the human body. But others found the story too strange to accept without suspicion. One theory was whispered among those who distrusted the inner workings of the imperial household. Perhaps the cut had been inflicted not by accident, but by design. A careless valet, a resentful servant, even a political agent? In this version, the wound was deliberate, small enough to avoid immediate alarm, yet deep enough to invite infection in a man whose health was already fragile. If someone wanted to harm Ferdinand Karl without stirring scandal, this was the perfect method. No overt violence, no public scene, just a natural death within days. There was, too, the question of his general health. Historical accounts suggest that Ferdinand Karl was never a particularly robust man. Decades of ceremonial life, combined with the mental strain of exile and the sedentary nature of his years in Vienna, had likely weakened his constitution. Any modern physician would note that such a patient, possibly with undiagnosed conditions like diabetes or chronic inflammation, would have been far more vulnerable to an aggressive infection. In that sense, the cut may not have been a cause so much as a final straw. Still, the absence of a public inquest fueled curiosity. In some circles, it was said that the imperial court avoided investigation precisely because they feared what might be uncovered. Not necessarily a conspiracy, but the embarrassment of admitting that an archduke had died in so undignified a way. A quick, vague announcement spared the dynasty a public relations disaster. The rumors even crossed borders. In Milan, still under the shadow of Napoleon's occupation, Austrian sympathizers lamented his death quietly, while others saw it as a symbol of the old order's frailty. Among certain French officers stationed in Italy, the story of the governor who died from shaving became a wry anecdote about Habsburg weakness. Proof, they said, that the empire's princes were unfit for the hard edge of modern politics. In the absence of concrete facts, people filled the void with their own narratives. Some painted Ferdinand Karl as a victim of palace intrigue, too inconvenient to the current political arrangement, too tied to a lost territory, perhaps too aware of internal secrets. Others saw him as a man worn down by years of quiet irrelevance, whose body simply yielded to the smallest misfortune. And there were those who preferred the simplest explanation of all, that life, even for an imperial prince, can end with no logic other than bad timing and worse luck. Yet there's a deeper reason why his death drew whispers. It was the sheer incongruity of it. This was a man who had navigated the shifting allegiances of European powers, fled an advancing revolutionary army, and survived the political coldness of a court that had no real use for him. To endure all of that, and then fall to a tiny wound seemed, to many, almost allegorical. It was as if fate had chosen a way to underscore how fragile the trappings of nobility truly were. The imperial household, for its part, maintained a studied composure. His widow, Maria Beatrice, observed the required mourning rituals with dignity. There were masses said for his soul, quiet processions, and the draping of black cloth over certain apartments. But there was no grand public ceremony, no attempt to weave his death into the dynasty's larger narrative. It was, in every sense, a death managed for discretion, not display. Perhaps that was the ultimate aim. In an age when rumors could destabilize as effectively as armies, the safest way to handle an awkward royal death was to let it fade. No scandal to investigate, no speeches to misquote, no images for satirists to lampoon. Just a line in the court gazette, a burial in the family crypt, and the quiet turning of the page. And yet, history has a way of resisting silence. The story persisted, passed down in memoirs, footnotes, and the asides of chroniclers. It never gained the force of a great scandal, but it never disappeared either. Like the small cut that started it all, the rumor lingered. Small, persistent, and impossible to completely erase. Looking back, the truth may never be fully known. Whether it was an accident of the blade, a misjudged stroke by a servant, or something more deliberate, the result was the same. A man of imperial birth brought down by a wound no one thought twice about at the time. And in that lies the most unsettling thought of all. Not that someone might have killed him, but that no one had to. In the world Ferdinand Karl inhabited, where appearances mattered more than realities, the tiniest flaw could become fatal, and the smallest injury could quietly close the book on a life once poised to govern. Ferdinand Karl's death, quiet as it was, did not end the story of the Austria-Este name. For a man whose life had drifted from the center of imperial politics, his passing could have been the final footnote of an irrelevant branch of the Habsburg dynasty. But dynasties, unlike individuals, are built to survive, not just in bloodlines, but in titles, symbols, and alliances that stretch far beyond a single lifetime. The Austria-Este house itself was an unusual creation of dynastic strategy. It was born from the marriage between Ferdinand Karl and Maria Beatrice d'Este, the last legitimate descendant of the Este dukes of Modena and Reggio. By uniting her Italian inheritance with his Habsburg birthright, the union was meant to bridge Central European power with the prestige of one of Italy's oldest ruling families. In a way, Ferdinand Karl was never just himself. He was a living vessel for the continuation of two great houses. That responsibility did not die with him. Maria Beatrice, though widowed, retained her rights and titles. She would live on for decades after Ferdinand Karl's death, outlasting Napoleon's reign and seeing the political map of Europe redrawn more than once. Through her, the Austria-Este heritage passed into the next generation, particularly to their eldest surviving son, Francis IV, who would later reclaim Modena after Napoleon's fall. But the transition was not seamless. When Ferdinand Karl died in 1806, Europe was in turmoil. Napoleon was still dominant, reshaping the continent through war and decree. In Italy, the old ducal territories of Modena and Reggio had been absorbed into the Napoleonic system. Francis IV, still young, had no actual domain to rule. The Austria-Este family existed as a title without a throne, a dynasty without its lands, a ghost of sovereignty waiting for the tide of history to turn. The court in Vienna understood the symbolic value of keeping the Austria-Este identity alive. Even without Modena, the name was a reminder of Austrian claims in Italy. A political card that could be played in the endless negotiations that shaped European borders. This is why Ferdinand Karl's funeral, though private, was still marked by certain ceremonial gestures. The heraldic banners of both Austria and Este, the presence of court officials from Lombardy, and the careful placement of his tomb within the imperial crypt. He was not only a husband, father, or governor. He was a cornerstone in the architecture of dynastic legitimacy. In the years after his death, Maria Beatrice became the central figure in preserving that legitimacy. She maintained her court, even in exile, as a living embodiment of Este heritage. She raised her children with a deliberate sense of their dual inheritance, instructing them in both the ceremonial traditions of Vienna and the Italian customs of her homeland. The message was clear. The Este Duchy might be lost for now, but it was not gone forever. That message bore fruit in 1814. When Napoleon fell and the Congress of Vienna began redrawing Europe, Francis IV was restored as Duke of Modena and Reggio, ruling until his death in 1846. Through him, the Austria-Este name returned to actual sovereignty, and the dynastic experiment begun by Ferdinand Karl's marriage to Maria Beatrice proved its resilience. And yet, Ferdinand Karl's personal role in that story was complicated. In official family histories, his governorship of Milan was remembered dutifully, but without the grand embellishment given to other Habsburg figures. His death was glossed over, the circumstances never dwelt upon. The narrative favored the endurance of the house over the vulnerabilities of the man. His life became a bridge in the family tree, necessary, functional, but seldom celebrated. This, perhaps, is the quiet cruelty of dynastic politics. The individual's struggles, failures, and even tragedies are often erased in favor of the family's broader survival. Ferdinand Karl's own political ambitions had been modest. He had been, by all accounts, a capable and conscientious governor, but never the kind of figure who bent history to his will. His greatest historical act, ironically, may have been to marry well and father heirs who would carry on the Austria-Este name. Still, his absence was felt in subtler ways. For his children, the image of their father was shaped not by public legend, but by the private recollections of their mother and a handful of loyal retainers. They inherited not only his titles, but also the burden of the silence surrounding his final days. To grow up in the Habsburg world was to understand that not all family stories were meant to be told aloud. The Austria-Este legacy would continue to evolve through the 19th century, eventually merging again with other European royal lines. Even today, the title Archduke of Austria-Este exists, bestowed upon descendants of the Habsburg family as a link to the past. It is a reminder that in the game of dynastic survival, the name matters as much as the land, and sometimes more than the person who carried it. In that sense, Ferdinand Karl's death did not end his relevance. It became part of a longer narrative in which his own life receded into the background, while the structure of the house he helped sustain remained standing. The Austria-Este name outlived him by centuries, and in the cold arithmetic of dynastic history, that is its own form of immortality. But for those who peer closer, there is something haunting in that immortality. It asks a question that history rarely answers. Is it better to be remembered vaguely as part of a surviving name, or to be remembered vividly, even if the memory is painful? Ferdinand Karl was granted the former, a place in the genealogy, a crest on the wall, but perhaps at the cost of being known as a man. And so, his legacy is twofold. Officially, he remains a pillar of Austria-Este continuity, a link between Maria Theresa's prolific lineage and the restoration of Modena. Unofficially, he is a reminder that in the Habsburg world, survival of the dynasty could eclipse the life of the individual. His cut, his fever, his final days, all folded away, leaving only the banner of the house to fly on. It is this quiet, almost clinical survival that makes the Austria-Este line's endurance remarkable. And it is also what makes Ferdinand Karl's story worth telling, not just for the preservation of his family's name, but for the human cost of that preservation. The day of Ferdinand Karl's funeral began without the cannon fire, processional drums, or ceremonial proclamations that usually accompanied the burial of a Habsburg prince. In Vienna, winter pressed down with a damp, colorless sky, the streets slick with melting snow. The city's heart was still beating to the rhythms of Christmas festivities. But in a secluded quarter near the Augustinian church, a more subdued preparation was underway. There was no public announcement to draw crowds, no courtiers draped in the full regalia of state. Instead, the mourners who gathered did so under the quiet knowledge that this was a ceremony meant for closure, not for spectacle. The Austria-Este line had to be represented. The Habsburg blood had to be honored. But the tone was stripped of grandeur. His coffin, crafted from dark walnut, unpolished save for a modest sheen, was lined in white silk. The crest of Austria-Este was embroidered into the fabric, the two-headed eagle of the Habsburgs flanking the Este coat of arms. It was a union of symbols that told the story of his life far more clearly than the ceremony itself. 6 pallbearers, chosen from the household staff he had known during his years in Milan, lifted the coffin onto a low bier. Their faces were not the rigid masks of soldiers on parade. They looked down, steps deliberate but unpracticed, as though carrying not just the weight of the coffin, but the memory of quieter, more personal moments. A kind word, a shared meal, a governor's smile. Maria Beatrice, his widow, walked behind them. She wore black crepe that fell in heavy folds to the ground, her face partially veiled, but her posture was unmistakably upright. She was a duchess still, the mother of heirs, and in her presence the dignity of the house remained unbroken. Yet, those who walked close enough to hear swore they caught the sound of her breath catching now and then. A grief carefully caged behind courtly discipline. The small procession moved through the cloisters toward the imperial crypt beneath the Capuchin church. This burial place was a vault of dynastic ambition, where the great and the lesser known alike rested under the cold watch of stone and iron. The air inside was damp, carrying the scent of old marble and candle wax. In these walls, the Habsburgs had built not just tombs, but a geography of power. Each sarcophagus placed according to rank. Each inscription a statement of political and familial identity. For Ferdinand Karl, the placement was delicate. He was not an emperor, not even a crown prince, but still of the blood. His tomb was set along the line reserved for archdukes, near others whose lives had also unfolded away from the highest throne. There was no golden canopy, no sculpted effigy in triumph. Just a rectangular sarcophagus, his name and titles inscribed in Latin, the letters deep but unadorned. The service was conducted by a Capuchin friar, his voice steady as he read the prayers for the dead. The Latin phrases echoed softly against the stone, almost disappearing before they could be fully heard. A few members of the imperial family stood at the edge of the small crowd, their faces somber but impassive. For them, death was an old acquaintance, another link in the long chain of burials they had witnessed in this same crypt. Yet, in the subdued ritual, there was an undercurrent of something else, an acknowledgement of absence. There were no military honors for his service as governor of Milan, no public eulogy recounting his years of diplomacy and administration. The city he had once governed was under Napoleon's control. There was no delegation from Lombardy to lay a wreath or speak a word in his memory. His life's work had been swept away by the tide of war, and in the official record, his role would remain a footnote. When the prayers concluded, the pallbearers lowered the coffin into its place within the stone casing. The sound of wood against marble was muffled, final. Maria Beatrice stepped forward, her gloved hand brushing the lid. She did not weep publicly. Habsburg widows rarely did. But those nearest could see her head bow for a moment longer than protocol demanded. In that silent pause, she was not a duchess or a political widow. She was simply a wife saying goodbye. The friar made the sign of the cross. The crowd echoed the motion. Candles flickered, their flames bending in the draught of the crypt. One by one, the mourners filed out, their footsteps fading into the cloister's stillness. The door to the crypt was closed, the heavy iron latch sliding into place with a sound that seemed too loud for so small a gathering. Outside, the snow had started again, light, fine, and relentless. The city around them carried on with its winter life, oblivious to the burial that had just taken place beneath its streets. No proclamations marked the event. No ballads would be sung. Ferdinand Karl had been laid to rest as a prince of Austria-Este, but not as a figure of public mourning. His life was closed as quietly as it had often been lived, dutiful, reserved, overshadowed by larger forces. Yet there was something telling in the modesty of it all. In an age when the Habsburgs wielded funerals as demonstrations of imperial power, here was a ceremony stripped down to its essentials. A coffin, a prayer, a family crest. It was almost as though, in death, Ferdinand Karl had been allowed to step outside the machinery of politics and be remembered briefly as a man. That, perhaps, was the truest crown he could wear. One invisible to history's grand narrative, but present in the memory of those who had known him closely. A crown of quiet dignity, laid to rest beneath the stones of Vienna, far from the noise of court and the battles he never fought. In the weeks following Ferdinand Karl's burial, Vienna moved on with an ease that felt almost rehearsed. The court calendars resumed their rhythm. Balls were held, envoys were received, and the same polished corridors where the Archduke had once walked now carried the laughter of other voices. The notice of his death, printed in the official gazette, faded from view as the paper's next issues announced new appointments, trade agreements, and diplomatic receptions. The empire did not pause for him. This was how royal forgetting worked, not by malice, not by decree, but by the quiet efficiency of replacement. His absence left no vacancy to fill. Milan was long gone to Napoleon's Italy. The role that had once defined him politically no longer existed. His name did not appear in the toasts of foreign ambassadors, nor in the correspondence of those jockeying for influence. The position he had held for 25 years became an empty title in the archives, one that future officials would read without recognizing the man behind it. Even his own Austria-Este identity began to be folded into the broader Habsburg narrative. His particular life blurred into the great tapestry of imperial lineage. The family's genealogists kept his name, of course, dates of birth, marriage, death. But without the stories, without the human details, those records might as well have been carved on cold stone. In the salons of Vienna, where gossip and memory often intertwined, Ferdinand Karl's story was already shrinking. A few whispered about the oddity of his death, a cut from a razor, infection, a rapid decline. But as the months passed, even that detail became an afterthought. new scandals replaced old curiosities. The focus turned toward Napoleon's moves in Europe, the reshuffling of borders, the births and marriages that promised to secure dynastic alliances. In Milan, the forgetting was even swifter. For many there, Ferdinand Karl's governorship was not a fond memory, but an era of distant Austrian authority. Those who had favored the French occupation saw his death as irrelevant. Those who had once been loyal had long since adapted to the new order. Public buildings that had once flown the Habsburg flag no longer bore his crest. His portrait, which had hung in the governor's residence, was quietly removed and replaced with symbols of the new regime. It was not that he was despised, far from it. He simply became unnecessary. History's attention is selective, and in the early 19th century, it favored the dramatic. Emperors who fell in battle, queens who died in childbirth, generals who shifted the fate of nations. Ferdinand Karl's life did not fit the narrative of grand tragedy or heroic defiance. His was the quieter kind of existence, one that could be neatly boxed, stored, and rarely reopened. Even in the family crypt, his tomb occupied no prominent spot. Visitors who came to pay respects to Maria Theresa, to Joseph II, to Leopold II, might pass by his sarcophagus without a second glance. There was no grand statue to draw the eye, no gilded inscription to catch the candlelight. His was a name you had to look for, and fewer people did. Maria Beatrice kept his memory alive in her own way, but she did so privately. She preserved his letters, his books, and a few personal effects, items that told the story of the man she had married before politics had begun to strip away his identity. But her role as a widow came with its own obligations. She was still the Duchess of Massa and Carrara, still a figure in European aristocracy, and her public life moved forward. Whatever grief she carried in silence. There is a certain cruelty in how easily the world adapts to the absence of someone who once seemed indispensable. For years, Ferdinand Karl had been at the center of Milan's administration, the representative of imperial will in a contested territory. Yet in death, that significance evaporated almost instantly. That, without land, without office, without a political cause attached to his name, he became simply the Archduke who died young by accident. The archives would not lose him entirely. His marriage, his governorship, and his genealogy ensured at least that much. But to the living memory of the empire, he became a footnote. The kind of name you find at the bottom of a page, mentioned only because protocol requires it. The kind of figure whose portraits are eventually sold off, misattributed, or left in storage until no one remembers the subject. History can be merciless in this way. It does not always erase the wicked or the unworthy. It sometimes erases the quiet, the dutiful, the ones who lived without scandal, but also without the kind of glory that cements a place in the collective story. And so, Ferdinand Karl of Austria-Este slipped into a strange limbo, preserved on paper, but absent from the imagination. By the time a generation had passed, his name was spoken only by archivists, genealogists, or the occasional historian chasing the margins of the Habsburg world. For most, he was gone entirely. His life summed up in a date of birth, a title, and an unremarkable line about a sudden illness in Vienna. The man who had once stood in the gilded halls of Milan, who had signed decrees and received ambassadors, had been reduced to a trace. And that, perhaps, was the final twist of his fate. That the most lasting thing about him would be the very fact of his disappearance. Not the cause of his death, not the policies he enacted, but the way he was folded out of history's active memory. In life, he had been a governor without a city, In death, he became a prince without a place in the story. History is often told as a parade of victories and defeats, of names etched into monuments and carved above palace doors. But I believe Ferdinand Karl's life reminds us of a quieter truth, one that's harder to accept. Not everyone who holds power leaves a mark. Some lives, no matter how noble their birth or dutiful their service, dissolve into the silence between grand events. What strikes me about Ferdinand Karl is that his story is not defined by a great betrayal, a scandal, or a fatal mistake. It's defined by absence. Absence of opportunity after losing Milan. Absence of purpose once his title became ceremonial. Absence of recognition in death when the empire had already moved on. And yet, in that absence, I see something strangely human. We expect the powerful to be remembered. But history's memory is selective, even ruthless. It favors the ones who can be woven into the grand narrative. The conquerors, the reformers, the martyrs. Ferdinand Karl was none of those. He was a steady administrator in a world that rewards spectacle. And when his usefulness to the empire ended, his legacy was allowed to fade, gently, almost politely, until it was barely there at all. It makes me wonder how many lives, noble or common, have slipped away like his. How many were buried with dignity, but without a story to keep them alive. We think of forgetting as an injustice, but perhaps it's also a reminder that our names last only as long as someone chooses to speak them, and that what survives us is not the title on our tomb, but the way we are remembered, if at all. Ferdinand Karl may not be a household name, but in telling his story, we bring him back into the light, if only for a moment. And maybe that is the only immortality that matters. The brief return to memory, the whisper that says you were here. If you've stayed with me until now, it's because you care about the forgotten corners of history, the shadows where stories like this hide. There are countless others waiting to be told. Lives that slipped past the grand stage, but still carry lessons, warnings, or moments of beauty. So if you want to keep uncovering the lost, the strange, and the quietly tragic, subscribe to Dark Ages Unveiled. Here, we don't just tell the history you know, we bring back the history you've never heard.